Thank you for inviting me this evening. Thank you, Ben. This talk on architecture of mass and sort of the physical building. It's been a good opportunity for me, actually, to sort of put my thoughts together. It's interesting, when you have to do a talk, you realise how little you know, actually, and how jumbled up one's thoughts really are. So this has been good for me. I don't intend in this brief, I'll be brief because it's so late, to give a historical account of religious architecture, because I think that that's not quite the point, but I'm using these 6 historical periods to point out some facets of architecture that one could reflect on and think about when one visits a church, and how to, as it were, answer the question or justify the statement. You hear people say, this does not look like a church. And of course, if you're British, that means it doesn't look like a Gothic church. Well, if the oratory is different, I realise, but if it doesn't look like a church, why doesn't it look like a church? And my hope at the end of this talk is that perhaps you can be able to argue with your friends as why this does not look like a church, or does, as the case may be. But before we begin, I'd just like to mention a few things, the similarity between architecture and language. Language is something we all use. It unites us together. But also language predates us. But without our articulation of language, our use of language, language dies. And you can talk about dead languages. So there's a strange facet to language. Both it predates us. We're immersed in English, French, Italian, Spanish, whatever it may be. But in a way, if we don't use those languages, they die, and they become dead languages. There's a remarkable obituary quite a few years ago now about a Trinity College scholar in Cambridge who knew 7 dead Iranian languages. I suppose someone had to, and it was him. But they were like dead because nobody used them. So, in a way, architecture is much the same. Every language results as a consequence of the history of a people, and no one is personally the origin of this experience of language. So to speak a language is to enter into an experience of society. And I think that's something we all experience and know ourselves when we try to learn a foreign language, is to learn the idiom. Not simply just the grammar, but the idiom as to how people express things. And of course, that marvellous word in Italian, simpatico, which does not, sympathetic, does not quite get it. It's something uniquely Italian. It's the Italian way of sort of describing someone who can just call, as it were, simpatico. We can't translate it. And therefore, all our languages contain idioms and words like this that are unique to it. But when we communicate with a language, we communicate, maybe unconsciously, a remembered history of our own language, of our own peoples, that we do not create ourselves. And therefore you could say, in a way, that language has a symbolic intention. The words we use and the way we express ourselves are loaded with a history before we open our mouths, and we make that history as well. So there's a symbolic content or facet to our language and the way we speak and the way we think. Now, architecture, as I said, exhibits these same qualities. Without use, architecture would not exist. It would remain building alone, a mute physical artifact. And most architectural forms that we see today have an ancient provenance that resonates with symbolism long before they were used by a particular architect. So long before Gothic Revival architects, neoclassical architects, even modern architects used these forms. They already had been in existence before and are loaded, therefore, with a symbolism and with a history. And William Netherby, the great art and crafts writer and historian, who wrote a book on architecture, mysticism and myth, which is a key text in the 1980s. And of course, it was he popularised Byzantine architecture, which of course is the architecture of Westminster Cathedral, which is much the same time. So, anyhow, here you see various images of the Last Supper. Of course, this is one of the very earliest ones in a Roman catacomb. This is a sort of 4th century one. Here is a Victorian image, and there is a medieval Italian image of the Last Supper. Well, in a way, no one knows quite what the Last Supper looked like, because no one did a drawing at the time, and therefore these are reflected back from current practices back into what the Last Supper looked like. So in a way, this speaks as much about the Last Supper as it does about the contemporary society and culture in which these were painted and created. Obviously, the top two on the left are much nearer in time to the Last Supper, and that's less than 200 years after the Last Supper. So that's from the same classical culture, so we can, see sort of, maybe because they're a close approximation, but still they are the products of the time and not a photograph. So it's got symbolic, rich meaning from that present to the past. Okay. And it reflects something about the artist and the age of production. And you also see here, okay, so to turn building into architecture is to dwell, is to think about dwelling. It becomes a setting for life. We enter into a pre-existing society of our family, our origin, the rituals of eating, even if you live by yourself, and our wider community. So when we enter an architectural world, we're entering a pre-existing world, a world which has been formed before us, though of course we, as in language, use it and form it too. So religious architecture, rather than simply domestic architecture, is responding to a bigger picture, because it articulates the relationship between God and men and women, which is not something static, but it's always involved a cult, whether private or public, the use of a building. But also a religious building brings with it a concept of an ordered and purposeful universe. The Christian doesn't, and uniquely to a Christian, we don't reduce this to an abstract concept, an immutable law, but we have a collectively remembered history, the church, the Bible tradition. We, of course, might think this obvious, but this remains incomprehensible to most modern architects. They've got no concept of a narrative of religious history or of revelation. All they have is an understanding of spirituality in inverted commas. So this is the one, I would say the key fact for a Christian architecture is that it's a remembered history. Every building has a relation between God and world, foundation and culture and society. But for a religious building to be Christian, it does connect God and men and women, but it's in a narrative history, not simply as an abstract fact. So, what has this to do with architecture? Well, Christian revelation is not simply verbal, but it implies a cult, literally public works. So, all religious architecture, pagan and Christian, create a place to commune with the divine, which might be described as creating a world within a world. And that, I think, is a fundamental first point of architecture. It creates a world in a world. I put this here because this is an 18th century vision of what Adam's house looked like in paradise. Of course, it says more about the romantic sentiments of the person who painted it. It's a sort of ruin, garden, than it does about Adam, because nobody knows. Well, obviously, he lived in a classically designed house, but anyhow, other than that, nobody knows, of course. Okay, let's look. This is the culture. Of course, this is the Parthenon, and then that's one of the temples at Paestum. I put this because this is a certain understanding of religious architecture. And here, obviously, the priests worship and place sacrifices in front of pagan deities. And they do that, and everyone else is outside. But what you see here is this intense activity and intellectual thought to create the perfect religious building. There is, like in their mind, a Platonic form of what the perfect temple looks like. And remarkable to say is that here in the Parthenon, I don't know if anyone has been to Athens, but if you go up there, the pavement on which the temple is set is slightly curved in order to take account of the distortions of the human eye. As well as these columns here in the middle are slightly thicker, because if you have a column that's straight, it actually, if it's very straight, it actually goes in the middle, very, very slightly. So they have fat in the middle, is what they call entastasis. And so this is all to create a perfect temple. The effort involved in doing this is a serious intent. Of course, these stone buildings were formed on wooden prototypes, so that this you can be seen as a timber column. The bit above here is because it's sort of a piece, so because the grain of the wood could be protected before taking the heavy load of a timber going in this direction. And I'm sorry, we're not very distinct at this, but on the side, the metopes and triglyphs, are like the ends of the timbers, and then a piece of wood to sort of, as it were, to make the thing watertight. And the whole thing is predicated on timber architecture, which is a remarkable thing, because stone is actually a different material. But this idea that somehow there was this prototype, this Platonic form, which they were recreating in stone, originally in wood. It's a certain world, and it's much more than the world of St. Paul, who went to visit into Athens, the Acropolis, and there the tomb of the unknown God in Acts. But this is the world that the first Christians preached in. These incredible temples that were built all on a divine or a Platonic prototype, in which votive offerings were given by priests. Right. Okay, why am I showing you this? This is the first, as it were, church. And this is what I mean to say, that this is creating a world within a world. This is a pre-existing Roman house in the town called Dura Europos. It's unfortunately been destroyed by ISIS because it's in Euphrates in the valley in Syria. But it was discovered in the 1920s and it was excavated by Yale University. But what was apparent was the complexity in layout and in iconography. I just put this on the right-hand side because from the same town, this is a Jewish synagogue, which is now in Damascus, these frescoes. And this is the earliest depiction of Jesus telling the parish to pick up your mat and walk. This is AD 240. But what you see in the baptistry is a series, of frescoes which is quite complex. Original sin, salvation, and resurrection. There's a definitive narrative. And here, in the so-called assembly, what we would call a church, there's a definite axis here, and you can't see and a place where the priest stood and the congregation stood, knelt, or sat, whatever they did. So when people talk about a house church, as if someone, this was the original Christian architecture, a house church, it's not the simplistic thing of, as it were, Vatican to imagination, misimagination. It was actually a very complex environment already in AD 240, because, as I said, A church is a connection between God and man. For the Christian, it's a narrative. That narrative has a definitive content, and you're immersed into that content when you go, in inverted commas, to church. So this is something before Constantine's conversion, and if it was here, it was probably everywhere else too. So this is the sort of world created out of pre-existing buildings, but it is a world. And that's one thing I think you can ask of any church. Does it create a world, a Christian world? And if the answer is no, it doesn't work as a Christian church. If it does create a world, then it does work. And that world is both, as it were, material, architectural, and also decorative. So what you see quite often in modern architecture is apophatic architecture, which is, as it were, big white walls and no figurative frescoes, paintings, mosaics. It's because modern architects can't cope with divine revelation. They talk about spirituality rather than revelation. So that's that. Okay. Also, the idea that early Christians were busy doing agape meals and sort of then the Eucharist is sort of not obviously in here. They weren't. So I think it gives another understanding of a liturgical understanding of the Mass, that this agape meal dropped out much earlier than maybe many liturgical scholars would like to claim. Okay, right. So this is just briefly the classical language of architecture is fundamental, because these attempts to create this recreate a Platonic archetype in stone that was originally in wood, has, as it were, created a language of building, which is based on a sort of human proportion, we'll see shortly, and has stood the test of time. So, obviously, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, and you can see here that the Romans have applied Greek understandings of proportional systems, which is the height of the column to the relation between the two columns, but started onto mass brickwork. And here we are inside the Pantheon. And then here on the left is a Brunelleschi, who is a Florentine architect, reusing the classical language for Sancti Spiritus church here. That's Borromini again, using classical language to create a centrally planned church with St. Ivo. And here is Sir John Soane creating one of the colonial office in the Bank of England, using language. Okay. So what happened here? So when the builders of the first generation of ecclesiastical architects under Constantine utilized this classical language of architecture, okay? Because it was like taking from the Greeks the seeds of the word which they possessed in their culture, their philosophy, and their architecture. And nobody thought, or inappropriate, to actually use the fruits of Greek culture in order to build Christian churches. But what you see here is, I would describe as a hybrid building, because you have, this is effectively a Roman industrial shed. That's a very nice one, but that's what it is. And all Roman buildings were like sheds, other if they weren't houses. So that there were basilicas, which is just a place for transaction, a place for business. It's like a market hall. But it could, a large number of people could be, as it were, accommodated in covered space. But this bit here has a completely different sort of feel about it. It's got an apse and this transept. But the two, I hope you can see, have been sort of strangely joined together. I don't know if that makes sense, but here you've got, this transept going quite a long way this way, joined with this the basilical hall here and the apse here, which you can see, I hope, in that picture there. That is that is sort of a rather strange juxtaposition of forms. And because this is where the priestly liturgy, the liturgy took place here, and that's the tomb of St. Paul, but the rest of it was just like space for large numbers of people, without, it was just empty. But you see that, but what you see here is another thing in architecture. We've talked about creating a world within a world. But that world you enter, you have to cross a threshold. And therefore there's a sense of procession. You enter from the outside world into the narthex, into this courtyard here. Then a threshold here. And then a threshold into the sanctuary. So there's a sort of a rising crescendo towards the Holy of Holies, where Mass is celebrated. But all churches orientated liturgically east, because that's the direction which the risen Christ is going to return at the end of time. So, in a way, this gold, eternal world, which is frescoed as on mosaic on here, is like coming in the other direction, if you're with me. That God, risen Christ, is coming back in this direction while we're going in this direction. Because, of course, as a Christian, it's not simply our search for God, but it's God's search for us. And this search has taken definitive form in the person of Jesus Christ. And it's his return that will be a definitive return when he comes at the end of time. So this gold and sort of elaborate apse is actually, I think, a sort of a screen for the return of the risen Christ back into the world. And we're ascending it, and they meet, as it were, where this Eucharist is celebrated. And that, I think, because it's not simply our search for God, but God's search for us. Okay. So here, as you see, this is the highly decorated. It really is creating this sort of divine world, but utilizing, as it were, the building materials, the building forms of an existing culture, which in itself has, as it were, spiritual or antecedents in this notion of this ideal, this pagan temple. So those are the case here. I just want to show this very quickly, is that whereby in St. Paul without the walls, the liturgical action takes place within the apse on the east. In Byzantine liturgy, the priests occupy the whole space, and you as a lay person just have to stand on the side or find them or mingle around. So even today, if you're Greek Orthodox Mass, they come out behind the doors and go around and go around umpteen times with the incenser, with bells, and they process around the building. So the liturgy, as it were, occupies the whole building, which is a very, very different conception for the Western, whereby the liturgy, priests were confined to the sanctuary and lay people to the nave. But in Eastern Orthodoxy, their liturgy occupied the whole building, and hence their buildings very quickly became centrally planned, okay? So not the longitudinal nave of Western tradition, but became centrally planned, because of course these perfect forms of circles and squares are sort of Platonic forms, were sort of as being thought of nearer to God than rectangles, which of course is true in one respect, but we'll see that in a minute. But so you're using classical language, creating a new form of centrally planned spaces in response to an understanding of number, proportion, and geometry. In creating a space whereby it's like total liturgy, the whole thing, not simply just in a sanctuary. So the key architectural ideas here are the role of number and geometry, the perfect platonic solids, which are on the filbias, and the controlled use of sort of natural light shining through coloured glass. So it must have been an incredible vision when it was first built. All the gold mosaic, coloured glass, the centrally planned space. It would have been absolutely incredible. And it was like a city of God, whereby there's nothing but liturgy, occupying the whole space. Okay, I present this of San Sabino because what you see here is again, obviously, the things that we talked about, the thresholds, the into the church, and then the choir and the nave. But what you can see here is that how this basilica has actually now the apse and the nave are much more coherent together compared to St. Paul without the walls, which would seem to be rather disjointed. You can see the thing is, as it were, creating it's a whole. And I think this is something I find quite interesting. Well, a bit wonkish, I know, I suppose to learn this, but it's almost as if lay people and priests are united in one sort of, as it were, space, which is hierarchically differentiated, but you can also read it as one space, okay? And I think this people about active participation being somehow some sort of Vatican II discovery. I'm not really sort of convinced very much architecturally, because this is like a coherent space where priests, this is not cut off from people standing in the nave. I put this here because this is like a marvellous threshold entry into the church. And I don't know if you ever would have been there, but this has got the earliest, there's doors, the earliest depiction of the crucifixion, which you can see here in the middle. But the doors give the whole sort of salvation history. So here you are entering a threshold, entering into a world within a world. Okay, so I think this, and you can sort of see how Byzantine architecture, because the liturgy occupied the whole building, and Western Christianity, whereby the liturgy did occupy the building, but not in the same sort of way. The actually was restricted to the sanctuary. You see how the forms of the churches are different, okay? So I think that would be like to a big careful of time. Right. Gothic architecture, which is, of course, close to the heart of many British people, and rightly so. What's interesting here is that the principle of this pointed arch is that building an arch, which was just taking things off the internet, never good things, and rubbish pictures. If this is a semicircle, this is a very, very shallow arch in this direction. Okay, so because therefore the height says 1, but the diagonal is 1.414, which is equivalent to 2. And therefore, it's a very shallow arch, and therefore extremely difficult to build. You need a really competent builder to actually do a shallow arch, because the voussoirs, the stones, have to be incredibly well cut. Okay, so this was the incredible advance of Gothic architecture. Some genius one day must have just thought that they would make this diagonal arch a hemisphere, and therefore making these arches high pointed, okay? So that if that is 2 across there, that's 1 height. It's a semicircle. But then you see, therefore that would be 1.414, and that's 1, and therefore it's 0.7 to here, and therefore that makes it a sort of, if you do your sort of geometry, it makes it a pointed arch, and that's much, much stronger, okay? And the ability to build a strong structure allows to dematerialize the walls. You no longer need mass masonry, and if you don't wish to. And therefore, here, and at the height, it becomes much higher, and you begin this incredible sort of journey of Gothic architecture, as it were, of bringing in light down to the ground. And I'd like to say that this would be another key facet of architecture, how to bring light into a building. And here it's not simply just so they can read because people couldn't, but light is equated with God. And there's a very interesting man called Edwin Panofsky, long since dead, but he wrote a book called Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism, because he thought there was a connection between the way that the Summa was, by St. Thomas Aquinas, the way it's structured, for the big question, why God is, not question 2, I'm sure it's called something else, but yeah, part 1, question 2, how do you know God is, or the existence of God? And then everything percolates downwards, every little, all the questions are rigidly come down from that, and into the individual precepts of the moral law. And in a way, he saw the sort of uncreated light being drawn down to the world of human affairs by the sort of being, as it were, uncreated, but being let in through this incredible structure that's simple at the top, but gets more and more complex as you go further down towards the ground. Now, is that true or is it not? It's a great theory, but there is something about the quality of light and the purposefulness of its construction that isn't simply just sort of, as it were, there must be some higher intent for this. It's a very, so you sort of see the ribs join, and how you get a lot of little columns joined together. And when you go to a Gothic church, you can trace the columns and see how they join together. So it is like a structure, like the Summa St. Thomas Aquinas. And of course, because this thick load goes with the stiffness, so that therefore these things are sort of stiff and can hold weight, and then these things are quite light, and then these walls here don't need stone to hold the roof up, because in actual fact the roof's quite light, and the cross bracing there is sufficient strength. And of course you've got, obviously a lot of them, you've got flying buttresses in order to take the thrust going that way. But it's creating a world, but based on light, I think, and based on sort of connection between this sort of uncreated light that God is, into you sort of bringing a light down to earth. So, right, okay, now. So, here, of course, one of the things that is the human measure. Because there's one thing that perhaps Gothic architecture was not concerned with, was the human measure. And here we have sort of, obviously the Renaissance, this is Vitruvius, Renaissance theorists' understanding of, as it were, Vitruvian man. Vitruvius was the only extant Roman manual on architecture, or the 10 books of architecture, that was rediscovered in the early Renaissance. And it's all about number and figure, and how to generate squares from circles, because a circle is the most perfect shape. So here we have, Michael Cesarino doing that in the 1520s, and here are various plates of Leonardo, I think, and of how Vitruvian man. I'm sure we'll be able to, if you do this, we should describe a square, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you. But I think the same. But in actual fact, of course, later on, the Renaissance discovered that not every classical building followed the same type. When the first antiquarians thought there was one unique model of classical architecture, every classical building followed the same proportional system. But of course, later on, antiquarians in the 17th century, 18th century, realized, of course, that they didn't. But this emphasis on divine and human geometry is something that new, really, in architecture. well, maybe rediscovered from the ancient Greeks, but this is something that's fundamental to to the Renaissance. And I think that what it shows to you here is that when you see, so you see here a man standing in the shape of a longitudinal church, which is a way they had to try and prove that the basilica-style churches of the Western tradition were indeed, as it were, proportioned on the human form, because to try and show that actually that these forms have divine providence, because obviously God created men and women. Okay. So here we have the sort of the earliest, in Renaissance terms, attempts, just as it were, identify the proportions of all the different types of of capital. And as you know, so this is the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite. That's like day one of architecture school. But anyhow, but there's a different proportion between the width here and the height of each of them. Okay. You know, in one of the Psalms it says, "Our daughters beautiful as columns." I mean, you don't say that now in English. It wouldn't be sort of appropriate compliment. But in actual fact, that was thought of the time being Corinthian columns by ancient Greeks as being, as it were, for females, and it was manly Doric, and I don't know what Corinthian was, but it was thought of being manly Doric and certainly maidenly Corinthian and Ionic. I'm not sure. So here we see the proportional systems generated by columns and the gaps between columns. And here we see, as it were, one of the quests that obsessed Renaissance architects was about building centrally planned churches. Because somehow these figures of squares and circles were much nearer to God than any other. And this is the Tempietto in Rome. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's a marvellous little minute thing on the site, mythical site of Peter's martyrdom. It's, well, I'll show you a picture in a minute. We can just see how, the sort of, obviously this is a later analysis, but you can just see how the geometry is fundamental in determining size. Right. So here we have the centrally planned church, and here we have various examples by some theorists, and here we have Tempietto again, and you can see it there. I don't know if any of you have been to Florence, but this is the Pazzi Chapel, which is really, really beautiful. And it's based upon, as it were, circles and squares, okay? And this is a third, and a third. All these proportions are thought of being as fundamental to designing God's church, because God himself is obviously perfect geometry, perfect number, perfect form, whatever that may be. But then geometry, these sort of, as it were, these simple geometric figures are sort of being appropriate for designing the house of God. But of course, what you do see is how reality crashes in. Is that, in actual fact, if it is a church, it has to have an altar and have to have a sanctuary. And immediately when you do that, you, as it were, create an axis, okay? You see this, so that this, is not essentially, this is essentially planned building, this bit. But of course, adding this bit here, adding an entrance, of course, as it were, changes that and gives it an access. But what you see here, so this is the earliest. This is what they thought Roman buildings were like, which is applied classical orders as pilasters onto mass brickwork. Here we see a more mature understanding of Roman architecture, whereby the column is no longer, as it were, part of the wall, but is freestanding. That's okay. So this is this again is I realise that I see that the screen's expanded that out, so I don't know that, but everything's a bit pulled out that way. So, but what you see here is
This is San Spirito. And here, you see Bishop Brunelleschi, who's recreated those arches that you saw on St. Paul without the walls, which is not a Roman motif at all, but an early Christian one. But you can see it's like a modular plan. It's like a modular plan of sort of squares and arch, sort of, squares to form, as it were, to build up a longitudinal nave. And you walk around and you can just sort of feel yourself walking through geometry, okay? And it's because of this obsession with sort of these perfect shapes and numbers. Here, of course, is, I think, one of my favourite buildings by San Carlo al Quattrofontano, which is in Rome, by Borromini. It's a remarkable building. It's a pint-sized because it's taken geometry to a higher level, because it's using ellipses here, 2 circles here, and setting on much more complex geometry, which as it's in 3 dimensions. So you see that like 3 worlds. There's where the liturgy takes place, the people at the bottom. There's this intermediate world, and there's the dome and the light. And in the way Borromini is stretching the use of a classical language, it's still thought of being coherent. It speaks about human proportion and divine origin. It's sanctified by time. But he's made his own masterpiece. He's added to this sort of incredible, what he discovered from Gothic, in actual fact, is that how light can absolutely transform a building. Okay, so you can, these concealed light sources in here, that you can't, and there's a concealed light source of windows behind the pediment there to create this sort of outer world effect of the dome above the people in the celebration of Mass. Okay, now, Christopher's been here and on an architectural tour. Here is another favourite building of mine by Bernardo Bertoni, which is again this sort of celestial world. Is it coming into us, or are we looking up to it? It's both, okay? So we're looking up into this world, and it's all coming down onto the little congregation of farm workers who this landlord built this church for. But these are sort of these are like flying buttresses, and this, because they could, the geometry and statics and engineering was enough this is how the load is taken. And then we can cut away everything else that's not load-bearing. So it's very, it's a remarkable sort of sense of space for something that's so small. But it's like using this sort of geometry and light to create this world that, as it were, which is a worthy celebration of sort of the Eucharist, which is the interaction of God's action and human action. Right, okay, so obviously we're British, and Pugin is a massive influence. After the French Revolution, and during the French Revolution, neoclassical architecture was very popular. It was a sort of classical architecture, but sort of quite cold in its interpretation. None of the warmth of Bramante or Brunelleschi or any of that, but very, very cold buildings. And of course, the whole ideology of the cult of reason and this attachment to neoclassical architecture made for an incredible reaction, which we call Romanticism. And therefore, Pugin would be in this romantic tradition, okay? And he's so the Victorian age is by and large revivals of Byzantine, Gothic, Moorish. Sarajevo Libraries was a remarkable building of Moorish revival architecture of 1900. So all these revivals
were taking place as a romantic reaction to both the Enlightenment and industrialization. But what you see here is none of the intellectual, as it were, rigor of Gothic, as you saw in the Ile-de-France cathedrals, and the relation of light and the columns coming down, in the multiple columns coming down into the ground, as were the one of the many, bringing light source down to the ground. Pugin, they are remarkable buildings, but I'm always thinking they're a stage set. They're creating a mood, a romantic mood, which is obviously English. So he loved English architecture of the 14th century, and therefore that was the apogee of, as it were, Christian culture in Britain. And therefore, he wanted to simply recreate this, and recreate this culture back in Britain as a sort of in distinction and reaction to the industrialization and to the cheap form of classicism by Robert Smirke. If you know the British Library and the British Museum, he hated that building. It epitomizes everything he hated about the cold, classical, lack of warmth and lack of God. Of course, he's a great polemicist, Pugin, and a brilliant writer and a complete maniac, but he did so much in such a short time. I think the key to his understanding him is he was a stage designer for Covent Garden before he became an architect. And I think that his sets, not quite opera sets, a bit more substantial than that, but it was like a total world. But in a way, he brought, I think, a moral tone into architectural discourse, which is a bit different to the sort of Platonic, Aristotelian, as it were, search for the ideal temple, cult, and liturgy. Public life, public life, and a much more strident moral tone. And of course, it's that strident moral tone that was taken up by the modern movement of architecture. So all those things, form follows function, truth to materials, all these sort of catchphrases of the modern movement. As it were, art didn't come out of nowhere, but came out of quite the sort of, as it were, strident tones set by Pugin. And because the Romantic movement is about setting a tone, and why there's no reason to say that my tone is better than yours, because you have to have a substantial argument. It can't simply be because it's the tone. And it's this sort of strident, I think, strident argumentation that actually, in a way, is a precursor to the modern movement. I'm quite convinced after reading about that recently. And I think it is because he wanted to create a culture. He was never quite received in the Roman Catholic Church. He was received in the church in rather strange circumstances. And all the bishops couldn't cope with him. That's a bad thing, but he couldn't cope with him because he was his own man. He was completely mad. And Bishop Grasser was always trying to calm him down. Who was the Bishop of Shrewsbury, in which this church is located. He brought a direct moral purpose into architecture. And but his influence was so great that, apart from next door, there are very, very few buildings built in the classical churches in the classical style in the whole of the 19th century, until sort of classical or non-Gothic until about 1890s. Westminster Cathedral. Very, very few. Because he created this world, but it was just sort of as a force of personality and in reaction to the contemporary world of the time, of industrialization and the consequence of the Enlightenment. Okay, so now I put this up here because this is a very archetypal, the modern church by Le Corbusier or Ronchamp. What I want to say here is that though modern architects like this church, they don't design them with any of the depth of this particular building.
this is a concrete form, well, this is the bottom of the door, but yeah, that's concrete form of the original tent of meeting in the desert. And you can see that because these walls don't come up to the ceiling. They're not supporting the tent, okay? The tent's being held up by internal concrete piers or posts around, a bit like you would do a normal tent. So this is just, you're trying to create this sense of this encounter between God and man. But it's sui generis. I have to say though, that when I went to say Mass there, on this architectural tour, the place was just transformed. All the men in black left, the architects, and then they went out and left all the pilgrims and other people in the building, and suddenly the use of it changed. I mean, the feeling changed completely when it was in use as a church. But it's pointed out as a sort of archetypal modern church. There's no modern church of anything of that quality. Instead, we get this, which is in Westminster Diocese. So here we have, so if it happened, I'm terribly sorry. But anyway, you see here, he's trying to recreate the same thing. So this is a tent held up by posts, and the outside walls don't obviously come up to the roof. So it's obvious that the outside walls don't hold up the roof, okay? And he's trying to make them look like wood, in concrete wood, okay? By doing the bark there, okay? So that's Westminster Diocese, but here, and this is why I say it doesn't look like a church, it could be quite right, because whereby in the earliest church in Europus we saw, it was a world which is both architectural and artistic. There were like the frescoes of original sin, salvation, redemption. So we're entering into a narrative world with Jesus Christ as apex. But because there's nothing here, it's so-called upon the crucifix, it's an apophatic architecture. And this is one of the great misnomers of modern church architectures. They can't do decoration or iconography. And it's, in a way, it's a reaction. So the Romantic movement is a reaction to the modern world. So now, because there's no engagement with the contemporary world, like Pugin, subsequently, there's no engagement. So you couldn't put a fresco here of the sort of, it would be strange to put the fresco here of the life of Christ of people in modern dress. It would just look really odd. But in actual fact, if this was Dura Europus, that's exactly what we would have done. And so something's been lost here. And this is the real issue of modern architecture, is how can you create a world within a world? Because, I mean, it could be fresco, mosaic, even if you had the money, or whatever. So, but could you put it in a narrative structure, a narrative framework in modern dress? It's really interesting. Most people say no. But does it mean that your faith is simply a relic of a past and it's got no engagement with the present? It's very, I think it's a sort of, and I don't know the answer to that. The last one here, there's another church built for the diocese. This does not look like a church. And of course, this is because, well, he's now Archbishop Cardinal, but George Stack gave a chip to the parish priest. He used to wave around a bit like Hitler did, and one as well, when he was there, he got chipped with Hitler, he did what he liked. And so he did this church here. And of course, it's completely non-transcendental. You've got no sanctuary, because sanctuary's in the middle bit here. And people sit both sides antiphonally. Against this bark of Peter, sort of, and again you can see the walls don't hold up the roof, etc. But it's an attempt within the framework of modern architecture, but it's not creating a liturgical space. Something's missing here. And I think that thresholds are missing. Thresholds, horizons, iconography, use of traditions of light, and hierarchy of spaces. It's just not there. So I think it would be roughly what I have to say. So, how you design a modern church is a really interesting issue, I think, because you can go through the history and you can point out these facets. I've tried to create an outline, but if you did them today, would it cost too much? Would anybody be interested? It would make a difference anyhow. Thank you very much. That's what I really would like to say. So thank you.